It's lonely where I'm at, my friend. Not because nobody's here, because almost everybody is. I look at them, they're all standing there, shoulder to shoulder in the same field, staring at an identical horizon, repeating the same instructions in their heads. Sit still. Look ahead. Do well on the test, or your parents will stress. After a while, none of them remember who even gave the instructions. They just become the background hum of their existence, their operating system, a default setting, an inherited script. Me? I never quite fit that mold. Maybe that's why I spent so much time staring out of windows and asking questions nobody seemed interested in answering. Questions like, what if the person you think you are isn't? What if John Smith, Jane Jones, the name on the certificate, the story in your head, the collection of likes, dislikes, memories, etc., etc., what if that's not you? What if that's the mask? A useful mask, a necessary mask, but a mask nonetheless. You see, the more I looked, the more it seemed that most people were not truly living. They were actually performing an identity, defending an identity, polishing an identity, terrified that someday someone might ask them to remove it. And whenever someone does peer beyond the veil, be it through meditation, crisis, psychedelics, grief, revelation, whatever you pick, the same thing happens. Reality starts leaking through the cracks in the edifice. The mask loosens, the script stutters, and something older, more primal begins to stir. Something that was there before the story, before the labels, before the performance. And now hold that thought, because we're going to come back to it, as this is where the true rabbit hole really begins. You see, we enter this world soft, open, suggestible, living beacons of a state I have termed inner sense. Children drift through states of awareness effortlessly that adults will spend fortunes trying to return to, often without much success. And then the program begins as the system kicks in. Sit still. Look ahead. Do well on the test, or your parents will stress. Silently, a cube was placed in your head, until eventually the wild round thing you arrived as gets pressed into a shape that society expects and accepts, which they can stack neatly on a shelf for its own convenience, ends, and intent. A square watermelon, if you will. That's what I call it. A perfectly engineered absurdity. A living thing forced to develop within a container of limits until it forgets what it was originally supposed to be. And the strange part? Most people never, ever notice. Why would they? Everyone else around them is square too. So the abnormal becomes the standard. They call the cage home. They replace their face with a mask. But every so often, somebody catches a glimpse beyond it. It may come via a dream, a synchronicity, an overwhelming moment of clarity, a brush with something impossible beyond the reg. And that, my friend, is when the journey begins. Not this journey out here of work by consume die as you run the treadmill with the rest of the plebs. Oh no. The one in here, the oldest adventure there is, maybe the only true adventure there is, the hero's journey, the descent, the trip beyond the map. Now, people like Jung booked that ticket, Philip K. Dick as well. Very different roads. They used a varying language, but they came to the same destination in the end. Both of them returned with stories that sounded suspiciously like madness to the unimaginative or uninitiated, until reality started catching up to their private visions. Now, I've spoken on this at length in the article at the link, as Jung went to the depths of his own mind and found characters waiting for him, fully fleshed, not fragments, not abstractions, realized beings that were intelligent, autonomous, and most importantly, teaching him things he did not know. Now, Philip K. Dick looked at the world and became convinced that reality itself was stranger than any fiction could ever speculate. He saw simulations before said things were fashionable and predicted so many trends, as well as describing, picture perfect, the world in which we are about to live. digital control before social credit was invented, questions of depth before society was able to comprehend his sketch. And here's what fascinates me. Neither man returned claiming certainty. They simply returned with mystery. More questions than answers, because once you look beyond the edge of the known, certainty becomes difficult. The map stops being the territory, and the terrain becomes alive instead of this sterile representation that most accept. Now, this is usually where people ask me, do you really believe all of this? That's the wrong question, my friend. A much better query is, why do we assume the current explanation is complete? Why do we pretend consciousness is truly comprehended? Why do we assume reality begins and ends with what fits inside a laboratory or some narrow definition of what is possible? Where has our sense of wonder and imagination gone? Why are our minds so different from the ones that built the pyramids and all these massive edifices around the world? Why does every single global culture have a story of a golden age where they said man was on a totally different page in the same book we are reading now? I mean, really stop and think. The greatest mystery any of us will ever encounter in this existence stares back at you from the mirror every single day upon rising. You, the observer, the state I call the witness, the thing that's having the experience, the thing that awareness is happening to, or through, or as. And that's where things got strange for me. Because I researched everything. I looked here, I looked there, I learned various practices, and I did all kinds of methods and tricks. But eventually, the theory stopped being enough. Mere speculation did not scratch that itch, and no book, no teacher had the required depth. And then one day, on this quest, I died. Or came close enough to it that the distinction hardly matters. And what happened next was nowhere near what I'd been told or sold. There was no tunnel, no choir, no judgment, no cosmic reception desk. There was just pure awareness. Clear, silent, familiar. It was though I'd returned somewhere I'd never actually left. There was a familiar newness in full effect. Now during all of this, I looked down and I saw my body from a third-person perspective, which is weird as hell. You have no idea how you truly look in this world until you've seen yourself from the outside. And I watched it. I watched it struggle. It was saturated in panic as I looked on with curiosity. And as it drew its last breath, none of it felt like me. Not in the way I'd spent my entire life imagining, creating, defending. See, the strangest thing wasn't leaving, it was recognizing a state that was much more familiar than the identity I'd spent years creating. And then, when I came back, when the machinery of this false self booted up again, everything changed. Not overnight, not dramatically, but permanently. Because once you've seen the mask from outside its grip, it is very difficult to believe its fibs ever again. And that brings me back to the beginning. Back to the loneliness. Back to the square watermelons. Back to the people staring straight ahead, because that is what they were taught to do back when. Now look, I don't think humanity is stupid. I just think they're sleeping, whilst firmly convinced of the opposite. I think we inherited answers to questions we never asked ourselves and then treat them as gospel. We accept beliefs that we mistake for knowledge, limitations that pretend to be the opposite, and every now and then someone wakes up just enough to notice. They may not become enlightened, they may not even be special, but they are definitely awake enough to realize that the walls may not be as solid as they seem and that there could be a whole load more to this deal. Like shadows in a cave illuminated by a flame in which you're held captive by forces you do not comprehend. They don't want the sun overhead shining on you. They don't even want you to know how you got into this construction, let alone how to escape it. These are the things, and I think that Jung noticed them. Philip K. Dick definitely noticed them. The mystics, they all spoke about them at length. And the shamans lived in the shadow's depth. Now, maybe every single culture that spoke of spirit, soul, ether, and consciousness was pointing towards the exact same mountain peak from differing viewpoints using the language that they speak. Or maybe not. I don't know. What I do know is this. True reality, it feels alive. It pulses with a silent vibe. Its information is active, not passive, and it is everywhere and anywhere in the exact same instant because it is infinite. The prime vibration is what we is, wearing flesh with stories in our head that we accept as self-evident, whilst never, ever stopping to question the fib. I mean, look, consciousness, when you truly live it, it feels vastly deeper than any hypothesis could reveal. And the more I explore it, the less interested I become in convincing anyone of anything. I'd rather invite you to look. Look honestly. Look directly. Look without borrowing my conclusions or anyone else's, because if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, from Jung, from Dick, from dreams, from death, from synchronicity itself, from the vast intelligence hiding beneath ordinary awareness, is that the truth isn't something another person can hand you with a nice little bow and an instruction manual. It doesn't work like that. It has to become an experience, a discovery, a remembering, something that is so intensely private and paradoxically universal as well. Just look at this language of myth and symbol. Look at modern movies. They're all playing the same thing out, but it's happening externally as opposed to internally. That to me is about as dim as having a scratch and then trying to itch a photo. People do it though. Why? Because they've hid the alternatives. What if the whole point of this entire adventure in the flesh actually is to get to know yourself? I mean, at the end of the day, I posit that we are within a huge game that we play using our souls as credits, and I'm strongly starting to suspect that the aim is not to become something new, but remembering something ancient instead. The same something that's hidden beneath the mask. Something that's been waiting patiently beneath the noise. For you, my friend, to recollect, reconnect, and reinvigorate your frame of ref into something that is lived, vivid, true, here, now. Not something filtered to death, third-person perspective. I mean, I call this effect the reality tunnel. And the reality tunnel is super slick. It's like, I remember in the 90s, I said to a friend on the playground, if I took your best friend's insides, like all the traits and things you like about him, and put them in the flesh of that kid you detest, how would your relationship change? Now, as I asked this question, I watched the gears in his brain jam, and he literally couldn't say anything for a few moments. And then when he responded, he said, I don't want to think like that, that's weird. And then he ran off. Now, I had these kind of perceptions running around in my mind all the time, because I used to wonder, what is it in me that likes or dislikes somebody? How did I know instantly that so-and-so was not a good person? Things like this made me wonder, like how could 10 people meet one guy and draw 10 differing opinions of him? These kind of things made no sense, and it strongly made me think that all of us are hallucinating. Now, the reason why I thought like this is way before any of this happened, I discovered a very interesting blip, and that is that schizophrenics did not hallucinate in my presence. Really let that one sink in, my friend. That means that my face would never shift, my tonality was never somebody else's, and thus it built an immense sense of trust with these people at the fringes of society that were outcast, medicated against their will, and persecuted from the days of James Tilly Matthews to now. Now, we had many interesting conversations at depth, and I used to set them little impediments like, can you drain the colour out of your hallucination? Can you make it speak with a different accent? Things like this, because I had a child's imagination, so to me it didn't matter, because it was like, well, if I can imagine that this cardboard box is a spaceship, and this dude's imagining he's got a pet panther, it is what it is. And like I said, that was very, very interesting. So in many ways, I was born for this. And I genuinely think one of the most corrosive things in this realm is the suppression of imagination. And they do this a million different ways, from the child who rises in bed and their heart is thundering and they're convinced that there's a demon or a monster under their bed, and their parents start gaslighting and invalidating them, saying it's all in your head and this, that and the other. And then after this they're sent off to school. And what does school teach you? But that's it, still look ahead programming. You see, this is where Jung comes into it, because he said everything that we don't accept, it gets repressed and it gets stuck in the shadow's depth, and if it's not checked, it manifests as fate externally. Now, people thought the PKD flipped his lid when he had his event with the laser beams and the fish, but you have to comprehend, this guy predicted an issue with his son's health and then saved his life. Now, there is another case like this called Patient AB, where a woman heard the stereotypical "be not afraid" as a voice popped in her head and said that it used to be a surgeon whilst it was in the flesh, and she had a problem with an inflamed brainstem. Instead of going to go see her nearest psychiatric professional, who would have no doubt medicated the hell out of her, she decided to investigate herself. So, she went to the hospital, told them what was happening, and luckily, the guy that she found was curious enough to say, okay, let's do a scan. And they did the scan, and they found all of the things that the spirit said. They performed an operation, things were cool, she went on her way, and the voices left. I really want you to consider the implications of this, because what if all of these people who are like mental patients were actually on the brink of a spiritual awakening, and then they had those forces turned against them in order to generate a profit for a system which peddles ineffective solutions which are only there to dampen their emotions and making them easier to control. Now, take this one step further and consider how the rates of schizophrenia went through the roof when the Industrial Revolution happened. Link that into what I told you about the square watermelon effect. And you can see why Jung wrote his Red Book and then hid it, because he was petrified that people would think he was a mystic and they'd throw out all of his other work and revelations and credibility. And the thing with PKD is, if you listen to his Matrix speech from the 70s, he literally told people that we are inside a simulation, there are strange forces at the helm, and whatever reality is, it is way beyond your wildest imaginations. I mean, go to the article I've linked and watch the video. You'll see people laugh at him. They're acting like he's an idiot. And yet, what he banged away at his typewriter under the influence of immense amounts of amphetamines is mirroring the reality we're about to live in. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, that makes the dude a prophet. Right? And if you read his exegesis, if you don't know of where he's been, of what he is trying to comprehend, then it just seems like mad rambling. And it's the same thing. Jung said identical, and I feel the same way. Look, I've written nearly 800 articles, right? And I know that in this realm, if you take 10 people, 8 of them will be like square watermelons par excellence. They're like, what the hell are you talking about with these massive walls of text and huge run-on sentences? It makes no sense to me. One person will know exactly what I mean, but they will play it stupid to see exactly how far along I am on the shadow's depth. Another person may have never heard these concepts, but they may ponder their own thoughts, and they will go away, they'll sit down, they'll read, they'll reflect on it, and then when we connect, they share their own perspective, which may vibe or it may differ. And that's what makes it so interesting. This is why I say that 81% of the planet are slaves, because they are enslaved to their ignorance, to this magical place I call the discomfort zone. Now, the discomfort zone is a velvet-lined rut. And it's called that because all around it are your fears. But on the other side of your fears is the life you truly want to live. You see, this is what's interesting, because I've been consulting and changing people's lives for decades. Decades. I always deliver 10 times out of 10. Because if I can't, I won't take you on as a client. This is what made me realize that there's some people who want to change and some people who just want to play the game. And that's cool. That's cool. If you're here to just go around the board, hit some skins, make some cash, do you. That's fine, all right? But the simple fact of the matter is, it's not really hitting like it once did, because we live in an era where you have more access than any Roman emperor could ever imagine, and yet people are dissatisfied as hell. I mean, if you, like me, are an 80s jit, you will comprehend that people from the 90s were generally much more with it. They were definitely slimmer, like I said in the previous video, but they were more cognizant, right? Consider the fact of how we eat foods that are shipped from around the world. They are soaked in all types of chemicals and preparations in order to make them visually appealing, but there is nothing within them. To get the minerals you'd need from one tomato in the 1980s, you'd have to eat a field of them now. Then consider all this contamination of electromagnetic signals and all of this. I mean, it's a bit of a tangent, but check this out. After I died, my soul couldn't get back into my body, in the sense that I discovered these blockages and repressions that would not allow me to resonate. Now, before this, I'd been seeking them, but couldn't see them, and that's because they were repressions. So I thought, okay, let's go and do a flotation tank. So I found this place that had one, and it was in the middle of absolutely nowhere. I'm talking no mobile phone signals, none of this. It was completely deserted. And I thought, perfect. So I phoned the place up and I said, listen, first time doing this, it's a bit of a special situation. I'd like to book a whole day. And she goes, well, you can't. And, I'm like, well, why not? What's the reason? Why can't I book the whole thing out? And she goes, well, no one's ever done it before. We have no idea what the effects will be. And I said, look, I'll sign a waiver which says I take it all upon me, all right? I want the entire, they were open for 6 hours. I said, I'll take the whole lot. So I went in, sitting there, floating. And once again, I had none of the expected things that they sell and tell. And that's when I came to comprehend that pretty much everything is wrong. And the ego, the false self, it will sell you what it thinks you want to know. This is why I still haven't fully read the Exegesis. I still haven't fully read Jung. I've maybe done 50 pages of each, where I opened them at random sections due to my intuition and found something that either corroborated or refuted what I was thinking, and then went away and thought about it. Because, I know loads of people who take drugs to get spiritual mind states. They'll watch a YouTube summary of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and drop a few pills or take a few hits or do whatever they wish, and then all of a sudden they're convinced they're a bodhisattva. Now me and all of them fell out because I told them, I said, look, you all are faking, right? This is not real. I said, if you can't get there without the lift or the chemical assist, you're not really doing it. And they didn't like that because, they were all stroking each other's egos. And this is the thing about the false self and really realness. And this is what I mean about it being lonely as hell. Because it's not about coming across as abrasive or this, that, and the other. It's just you don't have time for the fakery. When you live without a mask, you see where other people are bullshitting. And when you see where they're bullshitting, it's like, I used to do that, but now I know why I used to do that. Now comprehend, right? I spent the vast majority of my educational life getting kicked out of classes, and that gave me time to think. And when it gave me time to think, the main thing I used to do, because I knew if I left the building, they'd have a reason to expel me, so I'd go and speak to the groundskeeper. Now the groundskeeper had no education. All he did was just clean things up and fix stuff, but he had a massive stack of Reader's Digests, which he perused through during sessions, and I'd sit there and kick it with him and ask him the kind of questions I was thinking of, and he would genuinely listen, and he'd think about it. And then on the other side, when I came home, my education was with a whole load of street criminals, whose passion was intense. You have no idea how thrilling it feels to learn how to circumvent a lock, how to hack a computer, how to make things do what they're not supposed to do because that's what you want it to. So obviously, I was born to peer beyond the veil. So when all of these pieces fit, it hit like a straight line in Tetris. And that's what brought me to Jung, Philip K. Dick, and one of the most important references is a name that has been struck from the historical record. He was a colleague of Jung, and in my mind, an out-and-out genius. He called what humanity is suffering from the emotional plague, and his name was Wilhelm Reich. Now, I've written an article about him because he was just on a whole nother level, and it was his insights that I thought, this is 100% correct. I can't get my soul back into my flesh because there are repressed memories in my muscles held as nervous tension. So I needed to find a way to change that. I mean, look, think about it. You go to school to pay attention. You know what I mean? You are completely convinced that you're free but yet it costs to take every single step. Are you seeing how all of these contradictions and all of this stuff comes together? I mean, look, when you look at the world, when you look at your thoughts, when you look at the story that you inherited from numb, unfeeling parents who were born to the same, and the generational trauma that's been passed on one to the next completely unchecked, are you truly seeing it or merely repeating a pattern? I mean, look, are you awake or are you simply dreaming with your eyes open? How could you tell? I mean, that's another point, right? I was a child and I had a dream, and then the next night I had a continuation of the dream. Now my mind was flipped by all of this, because otherwise it was like fresh visions every single day. And every single person I said, that didn't happen, that can't happen. And I said it just did. Now the next logical conclusion for me was, well, what happens if the third day when I go to sleep, it continues where it left off? After a while, how am I supposed to be able to tell which world is really real? And that was the thing that truly underpinned all of Philip K. Dick's work, because he was quite certain that he was living a parallel life in ancient Rome and the empire never ended. Now, if he'd gone to go see a medical professional, poof, it would have been game over for him. And yet, what he laid down in his creativity, in his works, what he shared with this world, it's the same thing with Van Gogh, all right? Personally, my favorite artist. I remember the first time I saw his paintings, I was like, this is real. There was something in it that just spoke to me, something that you can feel. And then the more I looked into it, the more I saw he was rejected by his peers, and they called him an incompetent, and we all know about his relationships and all the other problems. But what most people do not know is that they recently found out that all the swirls he painted are actually here in reality, but exist at a level beyond the perception of standard humans. That's the territory of the shaman. He was literally painting the world as he saw it. And those swirls and whirls, they're right there in the background. These are the invisible currents that make up reality. And this ties in wonderfully to what I told you about the schizophrenics, because my mind was saying, well, hang on a second. They could be rich, white, black, poor, male, female, educated, dumb. You pick any variable you want. Every single one of them always says the same thing. And that is that there is something invisible tampering with their awareness, and they see things that others do not. Really let that one sink in and ask yourself, why is it a guy with no formal education that has spotted this link? No medical professional has looked into it. No so-called scientist that seeks out patterns and attempts to disprove a hypothesis has came anywhere near this. I strongly posit that these square watermelons, they're all tuned in to a consensual hallucination. And that's what makes gnosis such a dangerous, dangerous thing. Because people, they don't want to be happy. They want to be correct. They want to have their perspective verified. This is why I told you I deliver 10 times out of 10, but I'm very selective in who I work with. Because I can tell very quickly, due to my experience, who is ready to awaken and who wants to stay in the shell. And this is what's amazing, because we're at a point now where people have realized that it is a fib, that there is something sketch, that none of the things that they promised truly deliver on what they said. I mean, look, how many people do you think are stressed to death of presenting this false image online that it's perfect? You may do it yourself. You may know somebody who online is living the dream, but in reality they're sitting there eating cold beans. It happens, doesn't it? And yet you don't say anything about it. You validate their deception with a like, you leave a comment. We truly are a species in psychosis, and it is only the crazies that get it, because there is a fine line between flipping your lid and gaining enlightenment. And I truly believe Jung gained enlightenment, but then repressed the hell out of it, at least what he shared in public. PKD did, and then when he shared it, the only way people could accept the truth was if it came with a fictional tint. This is what led to the realize mindset that I have in the other playlist, where I decode movies and such things, because they're modern myth. Instead of you actually undertaking the hero's journey, you vicariously watch somebody else do it. I mean, one of the things I have all of my clients do is ask them, to dissect their favorite movie, especially one they watched again and again in childhood or the one that they come back to for comfort. I ask them to find the parallels between what happened on screen and what's happening in their own lives. And then I flip the script and I say, if I could click my fingers now and you lived that life, would you pick it? The article I used is, let's pretend you're Rocky Balboa, because everyone knows the story of Rocky. But genuinely, would you want to live this if you had the choice? Here is a man with immense talent and immense potential, and even the one guy who believed in him now writes him off and says that you're a no-good nobody. When the hero's journey comes calling, he refuses the call to adventure. And then he has no choice. He has to go through the whole process and everything goes as it did. But the thing is, when you take that first step, you have no idea of what comes next. And it's this fear. This fear is what keeps people in the discomfort zone. This is why a couple came to me that were constantly arguing and they said, we need a solution, we've tried everything, we've been to counselling and blah, blah, blah. And I said, it's simple, get a divorce. And they looked at me like I was an alien. You see what I mean about all of this, my friend? Now, you have to question, right? I mean, look, I asked you in the other video, how can you be the voice in your head when you are obviously that which listens? To a man and woman, it may not be on a conscious level, but every single schizophrenic had this level of reasoning at one point in their life. They're like, wait a minute. Now the rest of you square watermelons who are well adjusted, you lot genuinely believe you are that voice. When it tells you to get angry, you yell. When it tells you to be sad, you cry. That's a puppet on a string existence. And this is what I mean about what is it that's doing this? What is the invisible thing that the schizophrenics found that everyone else denies? How did Jung meet these fully realized entities that possessed more wisdom than him within? How did PKD surf through time? You know what I mean? Now, when I died and came back again, it gave me much more questions than answers. But that familiar newness, that feeling of me having been where I was before, it was exactly the same thing like I told you with the dream that continued. So these hints, this is what I say to you. In the article, what is your philosophy? I outline the timeline process. And basically, all you do is you get a long piece of paper, stick it on the wall, and you write 0 at one end and the present moment at the other. And you just keep on filling in as many memories as you can. Fill them all in. I have not yet met anybody who has more than 4 years worth of life that they consciously recollect between the ages of 0 and 10. What's in that other 6? That's the shadow. That's what's driving you. That's what got you into the zone of discomfort. And if you check that, if you bring it to light, everything will change. Now, I've seen people whose family structures have been blown up because of the repressions that were in there. I've also seen people who nearly lost their minds, and this is why I say it's not for everybody. This is for the 8%, the chosen, who choose themselves. And it's an intense process. But, once again, it was very common in this realm because this is what used to be the path of initiation. When boys became men, they went through this, and there was a risk of death. There was that chance that you may not come back again. But if you came out the other side, it was like all your stress had been dry cleaned and you were spick and span, ready to go. Because we've ignored this, we compound our ignorance and pass it on to the next generation. And like I told you in noticing the pattern with schizophrenics, how come nobody seems to click that children are born bouncing, energetic, radiant, a state that should be nourished and protected? But what happens is all across the board, by the time they hit age 6, that very glow begins to dim. Now, I could get into the neurobiology and psychospirituality of all of this, but I'm trying to keep it on the whole, going beyond the Red Book and Exegesis thing, because this is what it is. Because unlike either of these, I live in a world that is more attuned to the concept of a false reality, because we have computer games with graphics that are soon enough going to be indistinguishable. We have all of this technology. We have more freedom to discuss now than we ever have. We can cross-pollinate ideas. There is so much more that we can do, be, and feel. And that's why I think it's important for us to have this conversation now, my friend, because around the corner, we have sentient sex robots. Now, when I told people about this a decade ago, they were like, you're off your head. And yet, here we are. It's the same thing like before the Matrix hit. I was telling people that we're in a simulation. And this is what actually attracted me to reading PKD, because he was saying the same things. Now, to me, it was self-evident when I watched graphics go from 8 to 16-bit, and then I learned about Moore's law. I thought, well, hang on a second. If that's how it's going to progress, and it's going to happen so quick and smooth, then what's the chance that we're already in it? Now, this leads back to a question I had when I was a very young child, and I wondered why some people died. What was the cause of death? What is the meaning of it? Who decides how many times you get to go around the board? And the answer that was given to me is that we come to a funfair of the flesh, and each ticket can only have a certain amount of rides. Now, to me, that made perfect sense, and it was a way to make something very profound, very simple. And I thought, yeah, that's cool. That's great. What had preceded this revelation when I was not long out of my nappies was when I first realized that my parents were not always old. When I first comprehended that they too were once babies and something had happened to them that made them stop drawing, that made them stop singing, that made them want to stop taking their toys apart or stick a screwdriver in an electric socket. And I was horrified. I had an existential crisis, and I didn't have the vocabulary to be able to cogently express my terror at this. The only words that came to me were, what happened? And nobody could answer this. And yet now I sit at a point where I do know what kicked, or at least have a fairly good inkling. And it's this reality. It's like I told you about the reality tunnel. It's everything around us. I mean, look, when a baby is born, their brain waves are exactly the same as an adult under the influence of a hallucinogen. As they mature and they start going to school, they are in theta waves. In order to get the adult into theta state, you need a profound depth hypnosis. And once they're in that state, you can tell them to do anything and they will do it. Stranger still, like I told you in the rationalizer video, the brain will rationalize, it would backwards rationalize just the way your AI chat GPT agent does. It will make up something and speak it with total confidence, because it all comes down to the R complex, the limbic system, and the prefrontal cortex, aka the snake, bird, and monkey within you. And this all leads back to like fractal consciousness and coherence and a great many other things. But the single most important question I have for you, my friend, is when it comes to your life and the way that you live, are you leading or are you following? Really ponder this. Really ponder it. Next time you do something, check your motivations. What is it you hope to gain? If you have already done this thing again and again and again, and nothing has changed, is it not the definition of being insane to not attempt something fresh? Why do you resist? Why do you not persist in becoming uncomfortable with what you rejected? Draw that timeline. I guarantee you your life will shift in ways that are so beneficial that you cannot even currently imagine yet. Thank you for listening. Till we meet again.